This
is the African frequency,
where voices rise and truth travels.
If the story speaks to you, let it travel further. Subscribe live.
Three countries, one continent, and a single sentence that sent shockwaves from Ouagadougou to Washington. In just 24 hours, a speech from the president of one of Africa's smallest nations sparked a movement bigger than most could imagine. Farmers heard it in the fields. Students turned it into protest songs. And world leaders? They scrambled. But here's the thing. There were no bombs, no sanctions, no armies. Just one man, standing at a podium, saying what so many have only dared to think. And that's what makes this moment different. Not because it was loud, but because it was true. We are not colonies. We are free nations. That's not a quote from history. That's what President Ibrahim Traoré said this year. And he said it directly to Trump. Before we dive deeper, let me ask you something. Have you ever been told to stay silent? When everything inside you was screaming to speak up, ever had a moment where you realized being polite just isn't enough anymore? Drop your story in the comments. Your voice matters more than you think. Welcome to the African Lens, where we don't just cover headlines, we uncover the forces shaping the future. Whether you're in Detroit, Dakar, or Dublin. This story? It's yours too. Because power, dignity, and truth don't have borders. So let's go back to the day a young president stood before the world and said, "If you mess with one of us, you mess with all of us." A threat came through back channels. No letterhead, no confirmation, just a message. Trump warned African leaders to fall in line or face the consequences. And that's all it took. No one cared if it was real. Because what made people angry wasn't the proof. It was the pattern. For too long, Africa's been spoken to like a subordinate. Told what to sign, who to host, what to accept. Every partnership came with a manual, written somewhere else. So when that rumor landed in Burkina Faso, it didn't surprise anyone. It just said out loud what too many had already felt. Most presidents would have denied it, stalled, smiled, waited for it to fade. But Traoré didn't wait. He lit a match. In a speech that felt more like a warning than a statement, he told the world, "We are no longer colonies. We take orders from no one." No prep, no cue cards. Just a man in uniform, speaking like he'd already buried patience. And people listened, not just in Burkina Faso, but across a continent raised on promises and tired of waiting. Because what that moment exposed wasn't just foreign arrogance. It was how normalized submission had become. If you grow up watching your country rent its minerals while your roads stay broken, watching UN trucks roll in while your schools fall apart, you stop asking why. You start accepting it, until someone calls it what it is. And suddenly, silence feels like agreement. That's what changed. Not the speech itself, but what it interrupted. And across West Africa, something old started to crack. Not loudly, not instantly, but deeply. Like the first time you realize a rule was never yours to follow. The man who gave that speech, just a year earlier, he was still in uniform, not a suit. And that's the part most people miss. Traoré didn't come from a political dynasty. He came from a battalion. He wasn't groomed for office. He led a coup. In January, he and the Regiment of Presidential Security overthrew a government backed by Western allies. Not for profit, not for power, but because the people were done asking nicely. You could see it in the streets, empty markets, burned down schools, foreign soldiers walking roads they didn't build, and leaders smiling through it, hoping no one would notice. But people noticed. And more importantly, they remembered. Burkina citizens had heard promises for decades that things would change, that help was coming. But help often came wearing a flag that wasn't theirs. According to Transparency International, Burkina Faso had one of the highest perceived corruption rates in West Africa prior to the coup. Aid money vanished. Contracts went to outsiders. Security forces were under-equipped, yet foreign bases multiplied. That's not a mystery, it's a message. Most Americans would say, if my leaders can't protect me, I vote them out. But in a country where elections are rigged and institutions are hollowed, what happens when the ballot box becomes just another illusion? Burkina Faso answered that question in boots, not ballots. And that makes people uncomfortable, because we like clean lines. Good guys, bad guys. But real change is messy, and sometimes it wears camouflage. When Traoré took office, he didn't promise miracles. He promised honesty. He met with community elders, not consultants. He pulled troops from ceremonial duties and sent them to guard actual villages. He canceled mining contracts that funneled profits overseas. Did it fix everything? Not even close. But for once, the actions matched the outrage, and that created something more powerful than loyalty. It created belief. People started showing up at government buildings not to protest, but to volunteer. Local defense groups formed. Food donations were organized by civilians for displaced families. Because when leadership stops performing and starts participating, people stop waiting and start building. Maybe that's the real question we all face. Do we want governments that manage decline, or leaders who are willing to risk everything to change the story? That risk wasn't symbolic, because in the days after the coup, every global power was watching, waiting to see if this was a moment or a movement. And what happened next proved it wasn't just about Burkina Faso anymore. He didn't use a script. He didn't read from paper. He didn't even blink. Standing inside Ouagadougou's Grand Hall, surrounded by reporters and cameras, President Traoré spoke without hesitation. No teleprompter, no translator, just one man speaking on behalf of a continent tired of being spoken for. And the words? We are no longer colonies. We do not take orders from Israel. We do not take orders from America. If you mess with one of us, you mess with all of us. He paused, looked straight into the lens, not like a politician trying to convince, but like a soldier issuing a warning, and the world heard it. Within hours, clips of the speech began circulating, not just in West Africa, but across the entire global South. From Lagos street markets to Nairobi classrooms, it became more than a moment. It became a mirror, because here's the uncomfortable truth. Most former colonies have never fully felt post-colonial. Agreements still favor the outsiders. Military bases still fly foreign flags. Resources leave faster than aid arrives. And Traoré, by saying what everyone else tiptoed around, broke the fourth wall of geopolitics. Think about how most global leaders speak: measured, diplomatic, curated. But sometimes diplomacy feels less like dialogue and more like delay. And when survival is on the line, delay feels like betrayal. According to Afrobarometer, over 70% of young Africans believe their governments are more accountable to foreign interests than to their own citizens. That's not a fringe opinion. That's an entire generation questioning who actually runs their countries. So when Traoré said, "Africa is not yours to threaten," he wasn't provoking. He was translating. He gave language to the frustration millions had never been allowed to express publicly. And if you've ever been in a situation where you knew something was wrong but didn't know how to name it, you'll understand why that line echoed. Because sometimes, when you finally hear the words you've been carrying in silence, something inside you stands up. That's what happened in Mali. And it didn't take long before the echo turned into action. One speech, 3 sentences. Yet within 48 hours, military protocols began to shift across borders. In Mali, Colonel Goïta didn't just echo Traoré's words. He issued his own statement, dismissing decades-old defense agreements signed with France. Then came Guinea. Their president made a rare public broadcast, praising what he called a message of African dignity. No press filters, no diplomatic hedging, just clarity and alignment. But this wasn't just about what leaders were saying. It was about how fast people were moving. Hashtags like #Africa will not bow began trending across the continent. Students translated Traoré's words into Hausa, Wolof, Lingala, posting them in local dialects, painting them on school walls. Musicians sampled the audio into protest tracks. Suddenly, what had started in a government hall was now blasting from speakers in street cafes. This wasn't some slow-burn ideological shift. It was immediate. It was emotional. And it was familiar in a way people didn't expect. Because deep down, most of us know what it's like to feel patronized, to be told you're free, but still be watched, to be given options that all feel like compromise. In the US, that tension often surfaces around race, class, control, who gets to lead, and who's expected to stay grateful. In Africa, it's layered under decades of development plans that somehow benefit outsiders more than citizens. According to Oxfam, for every $1 of aid flowing into the continent, 2.3 flows out in the form of illicit capital flight, profit repatriation, and unfair trade. That's not assistance. That's extraction. So when African youth heard Traoré say, "Africa is not yours to threaten," they didn't just hear a leader. They heard themselves, finally projected at full volume. And that changes something. It's like when a community breaks the silence about abuse. Suddenly, others step forward, not because the problem is new, but because the isolation is broken. That's why this wasn't just a regional echo chamber. It became a continental chain reaction. The question now wasn't, "Do you agree?" It was, "Are you next?" And the first answers came not from official channels, but from the streets where change always starts before it's recognized. 3 countries canceled decades of military agreements, and no one gave them permission. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger didn't hold a press conference to ask the world what it thought. They acted. Troops were ordered out. Mining contracts were reviewed. Security deals, once signed under pressure, were burned on national television. That wasn't reform. That was removal. Out of that, a new structure formed. The Sahel Alliance, a regional bloc built not on paperwork, but on shared memory. Each country had experienced the same story told in different languages. Foreign armies were invited in to provide stability. But the longer they stayed, the more unstable things got. Terrorism didn't disappear. It spread. Villages weren't protected. They were abandoned. And the people who questioned it most were told to be patient. But what happens when patience turns into exhaustion? They stopped being cautious and started being coordinated. The Sahel Alliance became more than just military cooperation. It became a decision. Either we govern ourselves or we continue outsourcing our future. According to internal documents leaked by regional journalists, the alliance began sharing intelligence, border logistics, and airspace control, without notifying former Western partners. That wasn't just a shift in command. It was a shift in allegiance. Local media across the region stopped using terms like international partners and replaced them with external actors. The language was changing. And when language shifts, perception follows. People noticed. Farmers in Burkina Faso reported that military patrols, once absent, were suddenly visible near conflict zones. In Mali, reports of informal checkpoints dropped for the first time in years. Not because the threats vanished, but because the decisions finally came from within. And here's something many overlook. Most people don't expect perfection from their leaders. They just want to recognize whose side they're on. This alliance didn't promise prosperity. It promised ownership of failure and success alike. And for once, that was enough to move people. You could feel it in the way shopkeepers spoke about security, in how local artists started painting soldiers not as pawns but as protectors, in the quiet but growing belief that maybe, this time, the outcome, whatever it is, would belong to them. And that feeling was stronger than any treaty. When Africa speaks, the West usually reacts. But this time, they didn't. No sharp rebuttal, no press conference, just silence. Israel said nothing. France avoided the subject. And the US? A soft denial, then moved on like nothing happened. But under that silence, something started to rattle. Clips of Traoré's speech flooded TikTok and Telegram. Music producers looped his voice into club mixes in Johannesburg. High schoolers in Dakar wore shirts that said, "We are no longer colonies." No official endorsement. No funding. Just pure signal. Because when a generation hears a line that cuts through decades of noise, they don't wait for permission. They just repeat it. Most of them didn't grow up during colonization, but they've lived inside its leftovers. Foreign flags on army trucks. Foreign logos on hospitals. Foreign consultants rewriting school books, without speaking the languages inside the classrooms. And maybe that's why this hit harder than usual. Not because it was new, but because it was overdue. UNESCO once reported that in many West African textbooks, less than 15% of the content covers African empires before colonization. The rest? Slavery, conquest, recovery. That's not history. That's conditioning. So when Traoré said, "We take orders from no one," it didn't feel radical. It felt like someone finally naming the weight. And the people repeating him, students, drivers, workers, mothers, weren't quoting him to sound smart. They were quoting him because it sounded like them. Most Americans grow up surrounded by mirrors. TV, music, sports, tech, all echo your identity back at you. But if your story's been edited out of your own education, what do you even reflect? That's why this wasn't about foreign policy. It was about recognition. Because before people fight for power, they fight to be seen. And this time, they saw themselves. Clearly, sharply, together. 3 countries tore up military deals, canceled foreign troop presence, pulled out of long-standing partnerships without flinching. And the response? Silence. No major retaliation, no sudden sanctions, just quiet. From the very powers that once acted without hesitation. Not because they weren't paying attention, but because they had no leverage left to use. Burkina Faso had already sent foreign troops home. Mali had already cut the cord. Niger was already walking out of the room. There was nothing left to threaten, because the dependency had already been broken. In Paris, officials met behind closed doors, but said little in public. In Washington, press briefings danced around questions. And in Tel Aviv, nothing at all. That absence wasn't oversight. It was calculation. Because any direct response would only legitimize the shift. And the one thing these powers feared more than instability was losing narrative control. Meanwhile, on the ground, things moved fast. Border agencies in the Sahel began syncing intel without Western intermediaries. Local militias got formal recognition from transitional governments. And within trade corridors, French and American companies quietly started losing contracts to regional bidders. This wasn't protest. It was realignment. You could feel it in the language. Media outlets stopped saying international partners. They said external actors. Ministers stopped thanking donors. They thanked farmers. That's how shifts start. Not always with revolutions, but with rewording. And that matters. Because when a nation stops justifying itself in someone else's language, it's not just asserting policy. It's reclaiming authorship. Most Americans know what it means to vote for someone who finally speaks like us. But in much of Africa, that experience of recognition in public speech has been rare. Now it's everywhere. And it's spreading without needing approval. Not through embassies, Not through think tanks, through people. Talking, moving, choosing. Not louder, just clearer, more certain, less afraid. What shook the world wasn't that Africa pushed back. It's that it didn't ask for anyone's reaction. No press tour, no policy memo, no Western green light. Just decisions, made locally, acted on immediately. Mining deals were renegotiated. Military cooperation redefined. School curriculums rewritten. No noise. Just motion. In Burkina Faso, procurement offices began prioritizing regional vendors over foreign firms, even at higher cost. In Mali, public broadcasting introduced new language policies, shifting airtime to local dialects. In Niger, small-town mayors pulled foreign logos off infrastructure projects and began funding them through community bonds. Nothing symbolic. Everything structural. This isn't nationalism. It's something quieter, more permanent. The normalization of refusal. Because when countries stop explaining why they want sovereignty, they've already decided who they're building for. And that decision started to show up in small human ways. Young students began choosing Fulani or Bambara names over French first names. Families started boycotting imported goods, not in protest, but out of preference. Universities launched archives of pre-colonial history because no one else would. Most Americans take that kind of cultural confidence for granted. You grow up seeing your story everywhere, textbooks, movies, billboards. But if a people are constantly asked to admire what erased them, eventually they stop admiring. According to a recent Afrobarometer poll, youth trust in Western institutions hit its lowest level in over 20 years, not out of hate, but out of irrelevance. That's the shift. It's not anger, it's exit. And once people exit a system that doesn't serve them, they don't argue with it. They build outside of it. This revolution didn't happen in a burst. It unfolded in a rhythm, messy, quiet, unapproved. But it's real. And it's moving. Not because the world accepted it, but because Africa finally stopped waiting for the world to. What you just watched wasn't about taking sides. It was about listening to what's shifting. Beneath headlines, beyond sound bites, a speech, a silence, a pattern breaking. And look, this kind of content isn't about hyping revolution or defending any one government. Some of these moves come with risk. Some won't work. No one knows yet where it all lands. But from my view, there's something powerful happening when countries stop waiting for approval and start acting like the center of their own story. Maybe it's messy. Maybe it's overdue. But it feels honest. If this gave you something to think about, drop a comment. Let it sit. Share it if it says something you haven't heard elsewhere. And yeah, this isn't a one-off. We've got more stories coming, more turning points, more moments that didn't make the front page, but probably should have. See you in the next one.